Good morning, everybody, dear students, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this one-day event dealing with veterinary education that was organized by the Department of Veterinary Science. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and we are in a process of innovating our department. And today we will have the opportunity to learn and maybe to build a better formative environment for the students and more stimulating, hopefully, for the staff. And this day was born thanks to my head of department that first asked me to coordinate a committee on innovative teaching and supported this initiative today from the beginning. So to him, I would like to leave the floor for his formal greetings and the full introduction to the day. Thank you, Francesco.
So veterinary education brings together different elements during the young student process of learning, from theory to practices, from the cell to the animals to the whole system in the society. Veterinary represent the unique position in the society to bring together different aspects of the everyday life, from the environment to the animals to the human health. So this is peculiar for the educational process and an aspect that need to be taken into consideration. And students, the second aspect is that students are also changing as well. And so during COVID time, technologies for the educational process was under pressure between the two parts, from one side, the safety, and the other one, the learning process. We have done our best in order to mediate among these two challenges. This also was the opportunity to start reflecting on new methods and technologies and tools. So we have tried with many of them, sometimes with success, sometimes thinking that we should improve better, like 3D tools and other smart glasses and other kind of tools. In the veterinary education, there are also ethical aspects that bring us to reflect on new methods for the education. And of course, the learning process that started with COVID will never stop after also the COVID situation hopefully will be covered. So we are hoping to re-enter in a normal, let me say, educational process. During this time, there was a lot of effort of the president of the medicine veterinary course to safeguard the health of the students as well as of teachers, and at the same time to follow and to attend to the criteria for the European education at the Department of Veterinary Science in Pisa. So we are in the middle of this process, and of course the two-day workshop will be, in my perspective, very useful in order to stop, reflect, and co-design the new process of teaching and education. Perhaps teaching is a strong part of our everyday life, and to face these challenges today is extremely relevant, especially in the Department of Veterinary Science in Pisa, where we are trying and we are preparing ourselves for the EAEVE Accreditation process that will bring us to spring 2022. So, sorry for the starting trouble with technology. It seems that now everything is going better. And yeah, I hope the best for this day, of course. I will attending during the day to the wood presentation. According also, I have to mediate with the didactical engagements for this morning. So thanks again. Have a nice day, and I give the floor to the rector, Professor Mancarella. Thanks.
As Francesco already said, thank you, Francesco. Today we have also the great pleasure to have with us our rector, and I had the opportunity to ask his participation for this meeting on veterinary education when he had introduced the University of Pisa Faculty Development Program Insegnare a Insegnare. I was a participant, and Insegnare a Insegnare is teaching how to teach, so something related to our event of today. So our thanks to our rector for devoting part of his time to innovative education and teaching issues, and for his presence, although everybody today are in virtual presence. So thank you very much, and please take the floor.
Good morning everybody. Welcome to this intense and significant meeting, for which I wish to thank Professor Vincenzo Miragliotta, Miss Ilaria Lippi, Mr. Fabrizio Bertelloni, and Mr. Francesco Riccioli of our Department of Veterinary Sciences, and of course the director of the department, Professor Francesco Iacovo. I wish first to welcome our colleagues, Miss Susan Rhind from the University of Edinburgh and Miss Sarah Baillie from the University of Bristol. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm also very pleased to extend a warm welcome to the colleagues from the University of Bologna, Padua, and Turin, who are going to take part in the afternoon session. Well, the University of Pisa boasts such a long and glorious traditions of studies in the veterinary field. In 1818, indeed, long before the unification of Italy, a first important school was founded in our city on the initiative of Vincenzo Mazza, a veterinary surgeon of the Grand Napoleonic Army. And as early as 1839, with alternating vicissitudes, our university carried on the heritage of that first school, and in 1871 founded the Scuola Superiore di Medicina Veterinaria, High School of Veterinary Medicine, which at the beginning of the 20th century became the Facoltà di Medicina Veterinaria, the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, and more recently the current department. Well, this is the sequence of the main events over more than 2 centuries of history and innovation in the field of veterinary education. Since the turn of the millennium, it has developed new and important steps in the educational process, with an ever-growing range of postgraduate studies, as well as in the international relations. Not to mention the high standards achieved, especially in the field of practical exercises and traineeship, which allowed us the awarding of the certificate of the European Association of Establishments for Veterinary Education, EAEVE, in 2012, a few years after the building of one among our main facilities of excellence that is essential to the training of recent graduates. The Ospedale Didattico Veterinario, the veterinary teaching hospital, Mario Modenato, founded in 2009. That certificate, therefore, has to be considered as an award for our teachers, our staff, and our students, on the one hand, and for the whole University of Pisa on the other, which has always aimed at the academic excellence and the strategic growth, investing significant economic resources in the development of its own infrastructure. We invested in particular in the scientific research, as we know very well that adequate laboratories and equipment are crucial to carry out high quality research. And indeed, this is true in many fields of knowledge, as you know. Moreover, the first planning stage of the new Veterinary Learning and Research Center has just concluded, which is going to be located right next to the veterinary hospital. This project has been discussed for many years and is finally about to be implemented thanks to the financial coverage recently found according to the Board of Directors resolution. Once authorized by the relevant bodies, we expect to call for tenders next year. As you may see, over the last 10 years, after the awarding of the prestigious certificate, our veterinary department and the university have worked hard to maintain a high level of quality and innovation of their educational activities. And we undertake to keep on doing that because we are fully aware of all challenges and opportunities to face, also considering the renewal of the EAEVE validation next year, as Francesco just mentioned. Needless to say that our university really aspires to reach this new important goal. This meeting is the proof of our aim at increasing the awareness of the European education framework in the field of veterinary medicine through dialogue and debate. As a matter of fact, we firmly believe we can improve only by the constant exchange and dialogue among independent entities sharing, as all of us, the same values and responsibilities for the future of the new generations. And now, to respect the time schedule, let me only wish you a good day and say that by the end of this meeting, I am sure we will have many ideas to reflect on, helping us to chart new paths towards the future. So thank you for your kind attention and enjoy your work.
Thank you for this kind introduction to our rector. And so let's start with our works today. As said before, this one-day event was born when we started to ask ourselves with Ilaria, Francesco, and Fabrizio, what does innovative teaching means? And we were asked indeed to be members of this committee on innovative teaching. After having learned how to educate students, because traditionally in Italy, we learn how to teach just teaching. We discovered that education is a science, that in veterinary science there is a journal devoted to veterinary medical education. So through suggestions and looking at the literature, we were lucky enough to identify Susan Rhind and Sarah Baillie that today will drive us across the modern veterinary education. And this was, I thank you for their availability. And as everybody can see in the program, this route that we'll make today cannot avoid an acronym that was already mentioned, that is the EAEVE or EAVE, the European Association of Establishment for Veterinary Education. This association plays a role for harmonization and quality development in the European framework of veterinary science. So to this regard, we will have also today with us Alessandra Rota, that is our EAVE committee coordinator of the Department of Veterinary Science, that will discuss with our speakers on specific themes. This afternoon, instead, specific topics will be covered in a session that will be held in the Italian language. And Giovanni Barsotti, that is our DVM course coordinator, will introduce and chair this session, while our Vice Director and Delegate for Teaching Activities, Carlo Cantilli, will chair the final roundtable. Thus, I cannot skip this moment to thank everybody personally, and also the afternoon speakers that are already with us. And I thank them for their proactivity and kindness that was beyond any expectation. So thank you to Monica Forni, that is already with us, Stefano Romagnoli, Rosangela Odore, and Luca Rossi. And I asked them to participate in the discussion also this morning if they think it can be needed or they want. So I hope that everybody will enjoy the day, and please use the YouTube chat to participate and ask questions. This is the only way we have, unfortunately, because of being virtual. So question will be selected and then forwarded to the speakers. So please use the chat, and please fill also the presence form. We put a link in the YouTube description, and this will help us to understand the appeal of our activities, and also to maybe to build a community of people that are interested in this activity and in innovating veterinary education. So it is time now to leave the floor to Susan Rhind. That is our first speaker. Susan will give a lecture on the evolution of European veterinary education with reference to the EAEVE accreditation. Susan is a DVM. After she graduated in veterinary medicine, she earned a PhD in immunology at the University of Edinburgh, and is chair of veterinary medical education and director of veterinary teaching at the Royal School of Veterinary Studies in Edinburgh. So thank you, Susan, for being with us, and please take the floor. So thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Vincenzo, for that kind introduction. Buongiorno. Good morning from Edinburgh. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I'm just sorry that the circumstances mean that we can't be with you in person. I'd love to visit your wonderful university and meet you all in person. Hopefully we can do that soon. So my colleague Sarah Baillie is actually going to be working my slides for me this morning. So thanks, Sarah, very much in advance for doing that. So I'm going to cover some general observations about the evolution of veterinary education, and then I'm going to focus on the EAEVE, some aspects of the EAEVE accreditation relating to the standards that we put in the self-evaluation report. Hopefully that will be a stimulus for some interesting discussion later on. So next slide, Sarah, please. So yeah, that's we'll just move on from that one, Sarah. Actually, I've just covered that. Yeah, so what I thought might be an interesting way to look at the evolution of veterinary education was to look at it through the lens of one particular conference, the VetEd conference that's been in play now for over 10 years. It started in the UK, but increasingly we have wide international representation at this conference. And Sarah and myself and a couple of colleagues have just done a little bit of research, which is in press in the JVME that Vincenzo mentioned. And it tracks the abstracts of the topics that have been talked about at that conference. So, Sarah, next slide, please. And this is one of the figures from the paper, which, as I say, is in press. And it's quite interesting because it shows the hot topics and the trends that we have been exploring in the discipline from 2010 to relatively recently. And you can see that in the top yellow coloured bar is assessment. So assessment has been a growing and then stable sort of trend. It's always a popular area of discussion at VetEd. Clinical skills, again, has been on the increase. It's quite interesting that technology enhanced learning has in some ways maybe become or sort of been reducing over the years. And I think that's because it has become so mainstream. It's just part of what we do, and particularly in the last year with the pandemic, I mean, it has been the cornerstone of what we do. And then the other aspect, pink at the bottom, that has definitely been on the increase, as you would expect, is the whole topic of student well-being, so resiliency, well-being, how we support our students. And if we can look at this data in a little bit more detail, next slide, Sarah. What we can see is some of this broken down. So we've got the technology enhanced learning topics, we've got assessment, we've got all these areas that you can see on this slide. And today between us, Sarah and I are going to cover quite a lot of these. So I'm going to be talking about particularly a bit about assessment, which is one of my favourite topics to talk about. A little bit about graduate competencies, faculty development, and I was really interested to hear from Vincenzo there about your teaching to teach program and so on. It's a very hot topic, and I think it's really important when it comes to accreditation to have a robust faculty development program, and educational research as well. And then Sarah will be covering later on clinical skills, some technology enhanced learning aspects, clinical reasoning, and something about evidence-based medicine as well. Is there something wrong with my audio? I'm just seeing on the chat. Shall I carry on? Okay, I'll carry on. I apologise if there's technical issues. Next slide, Sarah, please. So I don't want to dwell on this too much because I'm sure you're all well aware of the evolution of EAEVE in itself, but I think it's interesting just to stop and observe the fact that this accreditation system is evolving in itself, and it's continually reviewed, it's evolving, and it has continually evolved to have a real focus on quality and quality assurance. And we moved in the sort of late 2000s to a system of a stage 1 and stage 2 accreditation, and it's all about having robust mechanisms of quality assurance and quality control systems. Next slide, Sarah. And as part of this, EAEVE itself became a member of ENQA in 2018, which is the body that oversees quality assurance in accrediting bodies, if you like. So it's almost like the icing on the cake of quality assurance. So it really is all about that focus on quality, which hopefully will come through in the rest of this presentation. Next slide, Sarah, please. So the last time I was at an EAEVE meeting was in Zagreb in 2019. Always wonderful to visit all these European cities. And as I said at the start, I'm sorry we can't be with you in person today, but hopefully those visits will be able to return soon, and we can get back to normal business. Next slide, Sarah. So as I say, the main focus of my talk is going to be around linking some of these evolving trends and themes in veterinary education to the evaluation process. And I thought the best way to do this would be to anchor it in relation to the contents of the self-study report, the self-evaluation report, which you're probably familiar with, but we've got the 10 standards here. And the areas that I'm going to particularly focus on are the QA policy, and then I'm going to look at curriculum, assessment, and academic support staff. So next slide, please, Sarah. So this is just an example, but when I'm talking about a quality assurance and a quality assurance culture, we often end up talking a bit about outcomes assessment and how we assess and evaluate and demonstrate to an accrediting body that we have a robust QA culture. This is an example from our self-study report from our last visitation back in, I think it was 2015. And I quite like this as a means to reassure myself that we had a mechanism in place to have robust quality assurance at each level, from the student right up to the institutional level. So at the bottom of this pyramid here, we have outcomes assessment around student learning. So we have a robust assessment process that is both formative and summative. We then, I think importantly now, and I'll touch on this again when we come to the assessment section itself, we should be thinking about student learning not only within a course, but how that slots together as student learning across different courses, how it all comes together to make that new budding professional, if you like. Then above that, we need to have systems in place that we can demonstrate we're assessing the courses themselves. So we need to have robust QA around the course performance, the student performance on those courses. In the UK, we have a system of external examiners, where we would always have an examiner from another institution coming onto our examination boards. We would have post-course questionnaires and so on, as I'm sure you would as well. And then above the assessing courses is assessing the programme, and this is the level of the pyramid where EAEVE would come in, or EVMA or RCDS, depending on who your accrediting body is that you're considering. We also have external examiners, and we also have national level surveys that go out to students, and also we can use the results of national level assessments at this level of the pyramid too. Just to recap on that, down at the bottom we have assessment of student learning itself in terms of our formative and summative assessment. We then have assessment of student learning within a year, so across courses. Then we would have QA processes that allow us to assess our courses themselves. This would typically be external examiners, questionnaires, evaluations, staff-student liaison committees where staff and students come together. Then this level of the pyramid here, assessing the Bvm S Program. This is our veterinary program in Edinburgh. So at this level, we would consider EAEVE and any other accrediting bodies. We would consider our external examiners, so examiners who might visit from other institutions. We would consider results from national surveys, and all these pieces of the jigsaw come together to allow us to demonstrate to an accrediting body or anybody externally that we have a QA process in place. And then finally, at the assessing the institution level, this almost goes beyond the program, the veterinary program. This is about external audit of our institution, and we have a national framework for that as well. This is less relevant, I think, for today's conversation. I think today's conversation is really focusing on how we demonstrate quality at the level of the program, the course, and for students across courses and at course level. Next slide, please, Sarah. So standard 3 then, the curriculum, if we look at what is stated in the preparation document for the self-evaluation report, it's very important to ensure that the curriculum is owned by a committee and not courses themselves. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have in veterinary education, because we have passionate educators who love their discipline and want to add things into their course, and they want to teach the students their areas. And increasingly, because of the expansion of knowledge in veterinary education, this can be problematic, because it means that sometimes a passionate teacher can't actually teach what they want to teach because there isn't the space in the curriculum. It's maybe not a day one competency. And this is why I think it's really important that you have a robust ownership of the curriculum by a committee, so that courses can't go off and develop their own areas that are not consistent with the core day one outcomes. And that committee should determine the pedagogical basis, the design, the delivery methods, and so on for the curriculum. And of course, we're required to have ongoing periodic review of the curriculum at least every 7 years. Almost, I guess, most schools will probably be doing it on an iterative basis anyway. Next slide, Sarah, please. And again, if we look at the EAEVE requirements, they ask us to ensure that there's a means to demonstrate the relevant competencies. And the current EAEVE standard operating procedure refers to the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons day one competencies. And there's a series of competencies here. There's 36 of them. And then there's that are competency framed, and then there's 12, a list of 12 that are basically the underpinning knowledge and understanding that that is required in order to satisfactorily perform these competencies. And one of the things that is increasingly being asked for, in my experience in accreditation visits, is evidence of mapping the curriculum to these competencies. Next slide, Sarah, please. And this can be as simple as just on a spreadsheet, and it may well be that you're doing this anyway. Some institutions have invested in quite expensive curriculum mapping software to do this. I would say that as a starting point, that's not necessary. That the work is in actually getting your outcomes from courses in one place and then mapping it through to the required competencies, and ideally using this as a check to make sure that all the competencies are taught, and then ideally that you know exactly where all these competencies are assessed and that they're being assessed in an appropriate way. And that leads me on to talking more specifically about assessment. Next slide, Sarah, please. And if we look at what's said about the standard on assessment, I've underlined what I think is the key aspect here. And again, this can be a challenge. It's easy to write something like this. It's perhaps less easy to put it into practice. We need to ensure that there's an assessment strategy that has coherence of the overall assessment regime and to allow the demonstration of progressive development across the programme towards entry-level competence. And this, to me, again, means that your curriculum committee, and you can either some institutions have a curriculum and assessment committee, some institutions have a curriculum committee and an assessment committee that are separate. There's pros and cons of each. But it's that holistic oversight, again, that I think is really important to demonstrate that there's a strategic approach to the development of student competence and that it's not piecemeal, it's not too widespread an approach. It has a strategic framework. And in the context of assessment, I just wanted to point you towards a resource that you may have seen already or may not. Sarah, next slide, please. This is a project that Sarah and I were involved in a few years ago. This guide is freely available online. It's a PDF guide to assessment in veterinary medicine. We're planning to update this actually at some point in the next few years because there's also been a lot of work on assessment, not least because of the pandemic and how we assess the online world. But next slide, please, Sarah. And within this guide, we frame this guide around the well-known model of Miller's pyramid in assessment. And Miller's pyramid is I think it is a very basic framework, but I think it's a really useful framework for us when we're thinking about assessment and approaches to assessment. And again, when demonstrating to an external accrediting body that we have assessment methods that are appropriate at each level of this pyramid. Next slide, please, Sarah. And just to remind about this pyramid, so Miller's pyramid has this hierarchical or structured approach where the knowledge-based competencies, the cognitive domains of knowledge and application of knowledge underpin the behavioural or ability of students to demonstrate that they can do something, which is above the line in the middle. This shows that they can do a task, and then ultimately at the peak of the pyramid, if you like, can they actually do it? Do they do this in their everyday practice, or if they're on a clinical rotation, do they perform in a professional way, and so on? And we can map our assessment methods to this pyramid. Next slide, Sarah, please. So this is the pyramid again, and written assessments obviously are required for the knowledge and application of knowledge domains. The demonstrating and the practical assessments would typically be in a simulated environment, but not necessarily. They could be animal handling assessments. They would often involve OSCEs, the objective structure clinical examination. And then we get to the top of the pyramid where we have our work-based assessment options. And there's lots of work going on in that space to work out what is the best assessment method at that level. Next slide, Sarah, please. So as I say, written assessments, multiple choice questions, very common in this domain. Extended matching questions, you might have free text questions. Then at the shows level, we've got the OSCE, the objective structure clinical examination. And then the assessment types at the top might be things like directly observed practical skills, mini clinical evaluation exercises, and I'll touch on these a bit more in a second. So next slide, Sarah, please. So if we focus on, and I'm very happy to talk about written assessments or anything later on, but I just want to cut, I think, to the area which I think can be most challenging, which are these top 2 levels of the pyramid. Practical assessments in a simulated environment would, classically now, I think most schools would use some type of objective structured clinical examination to demonstrate both to the school, the students, and accrediting bodies that students have been assessed in these key practical skills. Next slide, Sarah. So typically an objective structured clinical exam or an objective structured practical exam if it's something non-clinical, check sheet based, very structured. Sometimes people, these types of assessments are very formulaic, and sometimes people don't like them because they feel too structured and too constraining. But I think at the appropriate place in the curriculum, they're very helpful. I think they can also give the students confidence that, yeah, you know, I'm getting on here quite well. I can do these things now. I can repeat these tasks. I can do them. I can demonstrate that I'm safe to proceed to the next, perhaps more complicated level. Next slide, please. So when we get to that next level, this is where it becomes even more challenging. And this is an area that I increasingly see interest and interrogation from accrediting bodies in this space. How are you actually monitoring assessment in the workplace, and how can you demonstrate to us that the students are competent in that domain? And 2 methods that have been used in this area, next slide, please, are the DOPS, the directly observed procedural skills, and mini clinical examination exercises. And both of these methods are more holistic than the OSCE. I just mentioned that the OSCE can sometimes suffer from feeling a bit formulaic and sort of technically led. Whereas the DOPS and mini CEX more holistic and allows people to faculty to give feedback against specific competencies such as communication skills or general history taking. So they're more real life, which is why they're more at the DOES level of Miller's pyramid. Next slide, Sarah, please. And can you just move that one on as well? Thanks. So you can Google DOPS forms, and these are just some examples, and there's plenty of papers in the literature as well. But again, this is about taking the granular competency and making it a bit more realistic and real life. Next slide, Sarah, please. And the mini CEX is similar, and again, it's about providing the useful thing about all of these forms of assessment, whether it's OSCEs, DOPS, mini CEX, the result is very useful to the student in terms of feedback on their progress, because if a student does 5 mini CEX assessments where they're doing history taking and physical exam and communication skills and so on, and they're repeatedly getting feedback that their communication skills are below expectations, and they can take that on board and build it into their learning. And that, again, is increasingly what accrediting bodies are interested in. They want to know that you have a mechanism to identify students early enough that are struggling, so that they can then take that information as part of a good quality assurance process and build on it and address the deficiencies, if you like, and move forward in that way. So that's DOPS and mini CEX. There is another assessment method. I'm going to just touch on it briefly because I don't want to go into it in too much detail, because I think it's quite a new kid on the block, and I think there's still quite a need for some more research to be done into it. But I want to mention it because you might see it being talked about in JVME and various research presentations and so on, because it's a kind of trendy thing. So next slide, Sarah, please. And that is the Entrustable professional activity, which is interesting because it moves the assessment from an individual assessment about your communication skills or history taking or surgery skills towards the use of what's called an entrustability scale. Do I trust you to do this task? And it appears, at least I think from the research that's out there at the moment, that clinicians in particular find it easier to judge against that type of scale, which is basically, do I have to talk you through it? Do I have to help you with it? Or can I actually trust you to do that with me not even being in the room? So it's framing it around the construct of trust. So this is where, if you like, that does level of Miller's pyramid. This is where the conversations are starting to move to now. So if you hear people talking about entrustable professional activities or EPAs, this is about a scale that uses trust to gauge whether a student has met the relevant level of competency. Next slide, please, Sarah. And you can, probably one of the best places, if you're interested to look into more on EPAs, is the EAEVM, the American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges, had a working group developing a new set of competencies, and aligned to that, they have developed some indicative entrustable professional activities, so you can see how they would look and how they would map to competencies. As I say, I think it's quite early days for this in veterinary education, but EPAs have been used in the postgraduate medical education context for quite a few years now, and we're kind of testing them out in the veterinary space now as well. Next slide, please, Sarah. And I see this is just an example of an entrustability scale that I was alluding to earlier. You know, thinking about it, did you have to do it for the student? Did you have to talk them through it? Did you need to be there just in case something went wrong? Or actually, were you happy to be in the next door room because you trust them to do that? So I think intuitively, it has quite a nice feel to it. But like all assessment methods, it does need some more research. Next slide, Sarah, please. And as I say, if you go online to the EAEVMC's website, you'll find not only their new competencies, but their initial attempts at mapping some entrustable professional activities to these competencies. Next slide, Sarah, please. Yeah, and that's the EPA document that goes with that, that's freely available online as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, I just really wanted to re-emphasize the challenge, but I think the real need to have this curriculum level strategy and overview of your assessment, so that all the pieces of the jigsaw are very clear to the students, to the faculty, and to any accrediting body that comes to visit, to demonstrate that your students have met the required competencies. And the final thing, next slide, please, Sarah, that I wanted to say about assessment also, because it is an area of real interest for me, is that we also need with assessment to really think about what are we assessing for. Most of the assessment that I have been talking about up until now has been assessment of learning, making sure that the students are competent. It's a summative thing that they have to pass, or if they fail, they have to redo it. This is about competency, perhaps ranking decisions. The decision maker would be the teacher or even some outside body. But I think it's also very important when we're thinking about an assessment strategy for a curriculum that we absolutely don't forget these other two types of assessment. So assessment for learning, which is all about giving the students feedback so that they can develop, learn where their weaknesses are, improve on those, actually, so they can also learn where their strengths are. Then assessment as learning, this is more about students learning to make judgments themselves about their own status in relation to a competency. This is about reflection and a student saying, okay, I tried that task, I didn't feel confident with it, I made a mistake there, I now need to know I'm using that assessment as learning for me to go and improve. So when I'm talking about an assessment strategy, I think I would encourage the thinking of it not only in relation to the accrediting body's interest in ensuring competence, but in the student's interest in ensuring that they have support and feedback and a development process to work towards. So yeah, next slide, Sarah, please. Can you just move through the animations on this one? And again, yeah, so this is a favorite, this is a favorite quote of mine from a talk that I went to a couple of years ago. It was being given in the context of curriculum review at institutional level. But I love it because I think sometimes we can be guilty as educators of seeing something nice, shiny and new, and we think, oh, I'll put some Entrustable professional activities in my curriculum. Oh, I'll have an OSCE, I'll do this. If it's not part of a joined up strategy, then it can really backfire. It doesn't matter how good the method is in its own right. If it's not part of a joined up curriculum and assessment strategy that's owned by a committee, that's communicated well to students, then we can end up in this situation where we add wings to caterpillars, we add an EPA to our assessment strategy, and we end up creating this awkward thing that nobody understands because it's not a joined up process. So adding wings to caterpillars does not create butterflies, it creates awkward and dysfunctional caterpillars. Butterflies are created through transformation. So I think we have to be mindful of that, whether we're thinking about curriculum itself in terms of approaches to teaching and learning, or whether we're thinking about the assessment piece that I've just been talking about. Okay, so the last area that I wanted to touch on is in relation to faculty development. Next slide. And I was really pleased and interested to hear about the work that you've obviously been doing in this area, because I think it underpins everything that I've been talking about already. The need to have a robust and credible academic and support staff development programme. And again, if we look at what the EAEVE documentation says about this, next slide. It says that formal training must be in place for all staff involved with teaching. A procedure must be in place to assess if the staff involved with teaching display competence and effective teaching skills. Now that's easier said than done. And staff must be given opportunities to develop and extend their teaching and assessment knowledge, and must be encouraged to improve their skills. So all very laudable and understandable. We might want to have a discussion about this later, because it is an area that can be problematic. But next slide, Sarah. This is just a model that a colleague and myself came up with as part of a chapter on evaluation of teaching effectiveness in this textbook. And it's about thinking about faculty development and the types of things that can be part of an overall portfolio of evidence that an individual teacher might have. Now, part of that in the box on the left is about teaching scholarship, and I'll touch on that in a minute, but it is important as part of sound quality assurance mechanisms to have evaluation in place by the students, of course, by employers, and by teachers themselves. That is a very powerful one that I think we find really helpful in our own context. The notion of peer feedback and peer support, teacher to teacher, is really valuable. And we certainly find here that when we do peer observation exercises in teaching, that the person doing the evaluating gets as much out of it as the person being evaluated. It's all about sharing of expertise and sharing of experiences, and it's a really powerful tool, I think, in relation to measures of teaching effectiveness and creating a quality culture around teaching, if you like. So next slide, please, Sarah. So I mentioned the notion of teaching scholarship, and I think that faculty development programs like you have are absolutely central to this. I think, you know, looking at going back to where I started in this talk, where I was talking about our tracking of what's emerged as hot topics in veterinary education over the last 10 years. I think it's great to see that our discipline of veterinary medical education is now recognised as a discipline. It's a legitimate thing to do educational research in veterinary medicine. There's the VetEd conference, there's the EVE Educational Day, which is usually a great place to share ideas and so on as well. There's lots of other educational conferences. Often medical education ones are really good places to go as well. Increasingly, there are teaching qualifications that people can aim towards. And I just think it's really important, and again, Vincenzo mentioned this at the start, about recognising the science and the evidence that exists around educational research. I think we've moved from a position now where we just do things because it feels right. I think we need to do things because there's evidence that that is a good thing to do. And that we need to embrace the science and the evidence that exists in veterinary medical education in the same way that we would embrace the science and the evidence that exists in any other sphere of veterinary science. And again, Vincenzo mentioned the Journal of Veterinary Medical Education. It's a great journal. It's very vibrant at the moment. I know there's quite a big backlog of papers waiting to go in it, because so many people are getting interested and enthused about publishing in veterinary medical education. And again, there's lots of medical education journals as well, and lots of what's written in those is entirely transferable across to our context as well. We can learn so much from them. Next slide, please, Sarah. So yeah, and I've already mentioned this, that events such as the EAEVE Education Day, VetEd Annual Conference, increasing communities of educational scholars, people interested in education in its own right. It's great to see all these spaces growing and the interest growing in them, and I think it's very much part of a faculty development culture around education. So I think that's actually my last slide. I've got there's a series of references on the next slide. I also, Sarah, could you maybe move 2 slides forward? And I had posited some questions that I thought might be of interest to people, but I'm very happy to try and answer any other questions. I wondered about whether the aspect of a curriculum-wide assessment strategy, curriculum mapping, or assessing teaching effectiveness might be interesting places to explore further. But as I say, I'm very happy to try and answer any questions, and maybe Sarah will help me depending on where these questions go as well. I apologise if I was speaking too quickly in areas, and I apologise if there were some technical issues, but I hope we've managed to gain something from this presentation. And thank you very much indeed for your attention.
So thank you very much, Susan Rhind, for this presentation that was very interesting, and for sure touch some very important points in veterinary education. And I would say, although we are in front of, I don't know, maybe possible evaluators in our next visitation, that you touched also several critical points. I think they are critical points for many departments and veterinary education establishment, as they are called now. For instance, yes, I think your questions were, the question you proposed were very interesting, and we can discuss about them. I found, for instance, and this goes into the curriculum mapping, I think, when you said that we should ensure that the curriculum is owned by the committee and not by the courses. This is really a critical point, maybe also in the Italian system, maybe more than others. I don't know. We talked so much about the freedom of the teacher in the education and in research also, of course. And I think this is one point. And also when you said about the assessment strategy and in a strategic framework, this was also something that is sometimes difficult in our system, where it was amazing you never mentioned an oral examination, which is still so common in Italy, and it's our main way to assess the students still, probably, at least from the theoretical point of view, of course. And so there are really, really important points to discuss, I think. One thing that maybe, yes, as you suggested the point, I think that the curriculum mapping is, and development after the mapping, I suppose, is a I think it's a bit of a complicated thing to do in practice, and there might be problems while doing it. So yes, I think this could be an interesting point to discuss, for instance, if we want to start with that one.
Okay, yeah, sure. So curriculum mapping, I think the decision has to be made before mapping your curriculum. At what level are you going to map it? And I would always encourage people to do it at if you go into too much detail to start with, it becomes a monster and it becomes very difficult to keep it up to date. So I would encourage mapping at a very high level just to start with. So if each of your courses has a set number of core learning outcomes, maybe 3 or 4, if you take those and then map them to the competencies, and particularly when you look at the more softer skills and just making sure that they're in there somewhere. I think the devil is in the detail with curriculum mapping, and if you start too detailed, then you'll lose the will to live. It becomes but actually it can be a very useful high level approach to start with, to make sure that you've got all the basic domains covered, and it can be quite insightful sometimes. I think what we've found sometimes with curriculum mapping is that we realize that we're teaching something, but we haven't articulated it properly in our learning outcome because it doesn't appear on our curriculum map. So I think the mapping is really important, and I think it links perhaps to the first point that you mentioned about ownership of the curriculum. Is it courses or is it a curriculum committee, and how do you resolve that tension sometimes of a passionate teacher who wants to have 10 hours on X, but actually there isn't space for 10 hours on X? I think sometimes these conversations, depending on the individuals involved, can require more of a radical overhaul. And where I've seen it working quite successfully is that if colleagues who might be more resistant to change in their individual course, if they can be bought into the notion of a new course or a new part of the curriculum, that they are in it at the start, and you have a shared vision for that course, then sometimes it's actually much easier to start fresh than it is to try and add the wings to caterpillars that you might do otherwise. But ultimately, I think the other thing that is required is very strong leadership and a strong statement from the head of school level that if we're doing a curriculum review or we're having a curriculum committee, then that committee has the say, the individual doesn't have the say. And again, that can be easier said than done, and I think we've all probably got examples of where that can be quite problematic. Okay, so I'm seeing a question coming in which relates to assessment of the top pyramid formats, so, and how we accurately assess the efficacy of those. So I think that with DOPS and mini CEX formats, there's plenty of evidence in the literature that if you do enough of them, they can be quite reliable, and of course give good feedback to students as well. We currently use the DOPS type of format supported by OSCEs earlier in the curriculum, and we also use rubrics where we would assess students' communication skills, history taking, and so on. I think that the more that you get to the top of that pyramid, the more valid the assessment feels to the assessor, because you're assessing the students actually what they're doing in clinics. But it can be prone to arguments of it not being very reliable because this clinician might just like that student, and it's less objective. But the evidence is that if that objectivity is not so important, if there's multiple assessment points in place. So I hope that answers that one, and it maybe reminds me also to touch on the question of oral exams. I think you mentioned that these are still very popular. We still use orals as well, but only where we particularly want to assess the student's ability to communicate something orally. The issue about oral exams is that they're not reliable unless you use a lot of them, which usually takes up so much time that it becomes impossible to do. There's a section on oral exams in our assessment guide that I showed you the link to. So I'm not saying oral exams are bad per se. No assessment method is bad per se, but you have to think about the reliability. If you've got a set amount of testing time, say you've got 3 hours to assess a student, if you use that 3 hours to incorporate multiple choice questions and maybe some short answer questions, then you will have a more reliable assessment because you've been able to cover more of the course content. Oral exams suffer because they take longer and you can't cover so much, and there could be other bias along with it. So I would personally, my own opinion is that oral exams can be very valuable because they help our students realise that they have to learn to communicate things orally to clients, but that should be the learning outcome that they're being used to assess. There are much more efficient and reliable and scientifically proven ways to assess knowledge and understanding than the oral exam.
Susan, we have questions on chat.
Yeah,
from Gualtiero Gandini. If you see in comments, he says, I think that one of the most difficult parts for our teachers is to have practical example of how some types of assessments procedures work. Can you please provide some practical example of this type of assessment? It's very important for us to fix on some practical examples. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for the question. So an example of this then might be with the directly observed procedural skills. So an example is that a student has a booklet of these skills that they have to be assessed on at some point during their clinical year. The student takes the booklet, and it might be electronic, but in this instance it's paper-based. They take the booklet with them onto clinics. When they come across a particular case that they think they are ready to demonstrate this procedure on, they say to the clinician, can you sign me off on my DOPS for this? They do the procedure, the clinician gives them their feedback, ticks the thing, and then they've ticked that one off, and then they might have another 14 to do. There might be something to do with horses or cows or whatever. So that's an example. These can be very student driven, which I quite like about them. It's not so much putting students in a room and saying, right, go and assess that animal, I'm going to give you an assessment. It's actually in the moment, in the workplace, which is why they're called work-based placed assessments. The only downside, as you might imagine, is that, of course, in a busy clinic situation, then sometimes they can get in the way, these additional assessments. But I think that would be the best example of how they play out. And the mini CEX is the same idea. You know, can I, in this next consultation, can you assess me for my mini CEX on this patient? So I hope that helps. And if you go online or look in the literature, you'll find examples of DOPS forms and mini CEX forms that you can adapt to the veterinary context. I see a question also from Professor Romagnoli about teaching assessment, and yes, so this is a really good one, and I think that so in our institution we have quality assurance processes which require us to run student evaluations and the typical post-course questionnaire. I'm going to be honest and say that actually I think these are not always of great value, because the students I think often think, well, I'm finished the course now, I'm moving on. We do suffer from low response rates to these types of surveys, but nevertheless I think it's important that we have them. What we find much more valuable actually is something that we call mid-course feedback, which is a slightly more relaxed conversation with students while the course is still running. Because that way the students think, okay, the teachers care about how the course is running. If things aren't going so well, or if I can't hear that professor, or if they're talking too fast, or I didn't understand, that we can adjust again in the moment, and the students buy into that much better. So that's a slight tangent though, because in terms of organisation and quality, our post-course evaluations are key. It's run by the Central University at the moment. They will email the students out the form. We did used to do them on paper, and we got a much better response rate because the staff member was in the lecture theatre and we said, fill out the questionnaire. We got a good response rate. Now the students get an email. The response rates can be really low, and I think that's problematic in terms of reliable data. Our peer assessment that's in place is something that we've tried to make mandatory. I say try because you can imagine that not everybody does it, but one of the things that I think is really powerful with peer assessment is to say that what we are recording with peer assessment is that a peer assessment or a peer observation has taken place. The head of school's office or my office is not interested in seeing the paperwork or the detail. This isn't about punishing anybody or saying you're a bad teacher. This is actually about creating a culture of peer support. And as I've said before, quite often the feedback we get is that the person doing the observing gets as much out of it. You know, we might have a clinician observing an anatomist and they say, oh, it's really amazing how they taught that, or I'd never thought about doing it like that. So for me, peer assessment should never be used as a kind of stick. I think it's much more important to be a kind of carrot and part of that culture of developing quality, sharing, discussing, etc. around teaching. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if there are other questions from YouTube. I don't see YouTube, that's why, but maybe not. So yes, I think those forms are for evaluations of the practical activities are very interesting. You spoke about doing them in the clinical setting, but maybe they can be used also during the practicals or within the skill lab, I suppose. I don't know if Sarah is going to talk about that. This type of evaluation could be done also within the course, is not in the end as we usually do, I suppose.
Yes, they could. I think I would say that for when it becomes slightly simulated and it's in a lab or in a clinical skills lab or something, there's the potential for that to feel a bit more at the shows level of Miller's Pyramid, because it's not real. There's not in many instances there might not be a real dog, a real client, all the other things that you have to deal with in a professional setting. So, and again, Sarah may want to move in on this, because I think there are some skills labs where you can make them a bit more authentic. But I think the distinction is between what's a show, what's a mocked up scenario, and what's actually a real life thing with all the complexities that come with it.
Mm-hmm. And then the last topic you proposed was assessing teaching effectiveness. So how am I effective? Is this apart from the peer-to-peer or the students' evaluation? Do you think that there is something more objective or more, I don't know, other from the student results? Or?
So that's the piece that is missing from that little portfolio diagram that I showed. There was the scholarship, there was the students assessing, there was the peers assessing, and then there's the evaluation of the outcomes. So the outcomes assessment of the product, the students, if you like. Yeah. So I think in that regard, we would be looking at graduate surveys, employer surveys, and then possibly for us, we would also look at the students of ours who elect to sit the NAVLE examination, the North American Veterinary Licensing exam. We have maybe 30 to 40% of our students will do that. And it actually is quite a useful, because we don't have a national licensing exam in the UK, that's the only benchmark we would have where we can compare our students to students from other institutions who are sitting that exam. So I think that's about outcomes assessment in relation to asking the employers, asking the graduates themselves, particularly once they've been in practice maybe or in the profession for a few years, how prepared did you feel? So I think that's the missing piece to that suite of evaluations.
Mm-hmm. Vincenzo, I think there is another question from...
Yeah, Susan. There is another question from YouTube about open book assessment.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you, Laura, for that. The situation that we found ourselves in this year has led us to having more open book assessments. We actually, though, were thinking about having more of them anyway, because increasingly I think we're realizing that if the question is well written, it doesn't actually matter that students can go and look things up, because it's the process, it's the problem solving, and let's face it, when students are out in the real world, if we want this assessment to be authentic to what it's going to be like, then of course they can look things up. But the challenging thing is the reasoning, the problem solving, and so on. So open book assessment, I think it has to be carefully worked into a strategy. But certainly here, I'm really keen on pushing for more of this now, but it does require, again, faculty development in terms of writing the right types of questions that can't just be Googled. So I think as part of a suite of assessments, I think it can be quite valuable. I still think that there's a requisite amount of underpinning knowledge and understanding that a veterinary graduate needs to have, so that if they're in the field in the middle of the night, or it's a safety aspect, I think, to how much they need to have in here. And I think there's also something that sometimes gets forgotten about in relation to assessment. I think it gives students confidence to know that they know stuff. So, you know, sometimes there's a trend, I think, in higher education these days to say, oh, well, we assess too much and we should have it all open book and this and that. I think for our students, I think they panic. I'm already seeing it now in some of our students. They're worried because they've had more open book assessments last year. They've done well in them, but they're now worried because they think they studied differently, even though we told them don't study differently because you need to develop these approaches for the rest of the curriculum. They have studied differently, I think, because they're humans, and we probably all would. And now they're worried about the impact on that moving forward. They're losing confidence because they're losing that confidence that they have that requisite knowledge in here to take forward. So I think there's a balance between the very hard-edged summative assessment closed book, but also thinking about open book in relation to the higher order skills and making it more authentic for real life practice. So thanks for that question. I think it's a really good one.
Okay, I think that that there are so many aspects that we should still learn and use in our system and in our department.
Can I ask a question, Alessandro?
Yes, Vincenzo, of course.
Susan, thank you very much for your presentation. And there is something I'm thinking, listening to you, is the distance between what is requested and the point where some establishment can start from. So this, in my mind, needs a strong commitment, but also to allocate the resources in terms of time that people need to spend on these things, and this time is subtracted from other things. So sometimes people can think that this is something more to do and to add. So how do you think, or how in your experience, a veterinary establishment education, a VE as the SOP calls our establishments, can allocate resources in terms of money and time and people? Because I see, writing the self-evaluation report, that we need to look to change the way of working. How do you say, to put in a continuing education framework both academic stuff but also administrative stuff, because there are some aspects that are so this is something that needs also resources in terms of money and for sure of time that people can devote to this. So in your experience, how such a shift or the first step can be done?
That's a very difficult question. I think that it has to align with your institution's strategic objectives. I rarely look at strategic plans and so on, but they can be very helpful if your institution talks about excellence in teaching, excellence in the student experience, and things like that. Then it's something that has to be supported. I think it's very difficult, especially when in the kind of world that we've just been through, when everybody is so stressed and tired and all the rest of it, to think, oh, and this is another thing. But I think it absolutely has to come from the top. I mean, I've said before in presentations that I would never have moved into a role leading in veterinary education in my school unless I knew I had the support of my dean. If it was a dean who didn't rate education or educational research, then I would have been wasting my time. So I think there is an element about a public or outward-facing support for educational development, and then with that has to come the resourcing for the time. And I think you made a brilliant point there about the administrative side of it. These professional services colleagues are absolutely key to all of this, because a lot of the quality assurance types of things that go on in the background, the administrative staff are key to that, and you can't run a good teaching office without adequate resourcing in there. So it does require resourcing, and it does, I suppose, require to a certain extent a trade-off, or to what extent the administration is prepared to put the financial backing behind some of this, because it can't be done on a shoestring. But if it's part of your mission and part of your culture and part of all of this, and I think the scholarship side of it, the educational research side of it, can be really helpful too, because that shows this isn't just about organising teaching. This is actually about evaluating what we do, sharing it as a community of educators, and being part of a scientific community of educators as well. And I think that can be powerful to move the discourse away from administration, organisation, quality assurance. It's bigger than that. This is about scholarship and communities of practice, really. So I don't know if that helps, because nobody can magic up money, but it does need resourcing for sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. Alessandra, if you would like to add something, otherwise, if there are no more questions, I take this opportunity to remind to people that are listening that you can use the chat of YouTube to write questions for our speakers, and also to fill up the form for the presents. If somebody has
I just want to.
Yeah.
I just want to thank Susan, and I hope that her indications will help us not to make a strange caterpillar, but to to try to become some sort of butterfly sooner or later. So for this, thank you. And
You're very
Vincenzo.
welcome.
Okay. Somebody said something? Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you, Susan. I hope you will stay with us for answer more questions after maybe Sarah's speech. And see you at 11. I think the program says that the next session, the next talk is at 11 o'clock Italian time. So see you in half an hour. Thank you very much. See you later. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your coffee at home or in the office. We are going forward with this one-day event on veterinary education. Thank you very much for all the speakers that are with us. And okay, you can see everybody now. So now I'm glad to introduce Sara Baillie. Sara will cover 4 examples of innovative teaching. We had a discussion with Sara when I first contacted her about the word innovative. Why innovative? It depends on when somebody put the starting point. And so she's a doctor in veterinary medicine too, as Susan. Her PhD was in computing science, and she's the creator of several haptic simulators that are used in veterinary training. So thank you, Sara, for being here, and please take the floor. Somebody's saying me that YouTube is not working, so please make sure that everything is going. Yes, it seems to me that everything works. So, Susan, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you. Buongiorno. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a shame not to be in Pisa, although I have visited the University of Pisa. As Vincenzo said, I am a veterinarian, but my PhD was in computer science, and I visited the Department of Computer Science at the University of Pisa. I didn't come to your faculty, but I have been to the University of Pisa. So I was asked to give a series of short talks on some of the innovations that are taking place in veterinary education. And there are lots, and I've chosen the 4 that you see here. So I will be doing short talks on each of these. At the end of all of these talks, we'll take the questions, but do feel free to type your questions in the chat at any point as we go through these, but we'll answer them at the end. So I've chosen clinical skills labs, as they're making a huge contribution to student learning in veterinary education at the moment, and will continue to do so and continue to grow. I've also chosen flipped classroom because I think that's even more topical since COVID, and that is also a growing area in veterinary education. My third talk will be on case-based learning, and that has some real benefits for integrated teaching and emphasizing the clinical relevance of the basic science topics, and importantly, developing student clinical reasoning skills and developing that as early as possible. And then my fourth talk will be on evidence-based veterinary medicine, or EBVM. And that one was chosen because it's really gaining increasing emphasis in veterinary education internationally. So I'm going to start with clinical skills labs. And anyone who knows me will know that clinical skills labs are a topic that's very close to my heart. And I was responsible for opening the first clinical skills lab in Bristol about 10 years ago. And now it is very well used, and it's had a huge impact on student learning, preparing them for their clinical rotations and for their external practicum training. So in this talk, I'm going to cover why are we teaching clinical skills. Now that may seem obvious, but it is worth revisiting. Then what skills can be taught in a skills lab, and actually through the innovative educators involved with clinical skills labs, we find that many skills can be taught in a clinical skills lab. Then just summarize what the benefits are for many stakeholders, but particularly the students. Then share some tips that we've learned on our journey about how to make our skills lab as successful as possible. And then close this first talk by looking at how we measure the impact of having a skills lab and how that can be linked to EAEVE. So the first point I want to talk about is, why are we teaching clinical skills? And as I say, this may seem really obvious because it is about point one there. Clinical skills help to prepare students to work as veterinarians, and very much with an emphasis on day one. So the skills they need to be successful when they graduate, that day one in practice. So we're focusing on the most important and relevant skills that they'll need. But another important reason we're teaching clinical skills is accreditation. So EAEVE, AVMA, the American, or our Royal College, all have day one competencies, and they all include practical and clinical skills. Now, I would say if you have an accreditation looming, that you may swap numbers 1 and 2, the order of them. But obviously, preparing students for graduation and for working as vets is the most important one. But with an accreditation looming, that can really focus your minds on the clinical skills teaching provision that you have in your curriculum. And having a structured clinical skills program within that curriculum will really help the students to prepare and then optimize their learning with animals in the clinics or on placements, etc. Many benefits for students, staff, employers, future employers, and of course, animal welfare. But clinical skills teaching may also need further enhancement when you map your curriculum. Now, Susan spoke about mapping, and sometimes we do find gaps against the competencies, and that means we're going to have to address those gaps. And that may well be in your clinical skills teaching or assessment. And then there's also, Susan's spoken about outcomes assessment, and where we get graduate and recent and employer feedback, and they may identify where a lack of certain clinical skills has affected their ability to do the job, and therefore we need to look at our curriculum, our clinical skills teaching, and address that. So clinical skills labs have very much come to the fore of helping us with clinical skills teaching, and they can really enhance that teaching. And I was involved in a survey in 2015 to look at clinical skills labs around the world. And at that point, we had 16 responses. So 16 clinical skills labs in veterinary schools sent us data. We're now about to repeat that survey. And we actually expect that we will probably get data from 100 or so clinical skills labs. So there's a very, very rapid growth in this area. And then another area, I set up a veterinary clinical skills and simulation online group about a year ago, and that group has nearly 400 members who represent 40 countries from over 80 universities. So this is a really important and growing field. So let's think about what skills can be taught in clinical skills labs. And I'll use these photos to cover some of the areas. I mean, there are a huge number and it's growing, and there's a lot of innovation in this area, which means that new models are being made that can help us teach these skills. So on the bottom right, we can do some of the animal handling skills, as roping a cow, but also, for example, putting a head collar on a horse, a model horse. It's good that the students learn how to do the technical part of it before they're actually with the animal, when there can be some safety issues and animal welfare issues. If we go to the top left, we have surgical skills. That's learning suturing. It's actually on a tea towel that's folded over, so there is an incision. Then if we go to the bottom left, we have anesthesia. That's an Ikea dog that has been adapted with trachea and lungs so the students can practice intubation. And the top right is another dog that's been modified for otoscopy. So it has a vertical canal, a horizontal canal, and tympanic membrane. But there are many, many more. And the reason I think that clinical skills labs are growing so fast and the number of models is increasing is there are so many benefits of having a skills lab. So some of what I've got on this slide comes from the survey that we published in JVME and the benefits that the respondents identified. So it's a great venue for teaching, and it means that your teaching of certain skills can be much more standardized, scheduled, and planned. Because with live animals, sometimes it can be difficult to ensure that all students achieve the learning outcomes. Whereas if you're using models, then it can be much more structured and standardized. It's a student-centered learning space. It's safe. no consequences if you make a mistake. Also, they can practice and practice, and these skills do require practice. It's a bit like if you're a musician or play sport, you've got to practice. And similarly, if you're a surgeon, you're going to have to practice lots of times. So they can come back to the skills lab and practice multiple times, and when they need to, perhaps before rotations or an OSCE. It's also a good venue for running assessments. So OSCEs, which are at the shows level of Miller's Pyramid, so they're demonstrating just this technical ability, which of course they need before they perform skills in a workplace, can be run very well in a skills lab. And overall, what the skills lab is doing is complementing the use of animals. So we sometimes talk about the 3 R's, and it definitely can refine and reduce the use of animals in teaching. But how can we make our skills lab successful? So I want to share a few tips from our experiences. So the picture on the right is our skills lab, which opened in 2012. So the first thing I would say is thinking about the models that you're going to put in your skills lab. They want to be reusable, cheap if possible, and you can be quite innovative in how you make them and develop them. So I've got a few examples here. The one on the left is an ophthalmology model. So the eyeball is actually a ping pong ball, and it's been painted inside and it has words inside, so that if the students are using the ophthalmoscope correctly, they will be able to read the word. Otherwise, you don't know if they're actually seeing what you want them to see. In the middle, we have a bit of a play on 101 Dalmatians. I presented this with some colleagues at a conference, 101 uses of Ikea dogs. So Ikea makes this dog, which is very adaptable. So it can be adapted, things put inside it for palpation. It can be used for surgical prep and procedures, cystocentesis with a bladder put in it, intubation, etc., etc. If we go to the top right, that is a relatively cheap bitch spay model. It costs about €1 to replace and reset the parts. But what it does is it focuses on some of the really difficult skills about a bitch spay, which is breaking the ligament and tying the ligatures. And it is a very good teaching model for those parts of the skill. Skills lab technicians and teachers use a lot of silicone because it's reusable. So the little holes, when you puncture it with a needle, will reseal. We've got some examples there of dog skin, cow muscle, cow skin. We also have cow uterus, but it's also used for veins and will reseal after punctured. But as well as the models, you need some supporting learning resources. So if students are going to learn these skills, they do need resources to help them. Obviously, we're one of those resources, but there are some really good videos. And the good news about this, Hanover has a YouTube channel. So they have some really excellent videos that you can access free from them. We also at Bristol have our own website where we post all our instruction booklets, and they're also free. So you can go there and download those for a very wide range of techniques. So you're going to need supporting learning resources, but the good news is there's a lot of free stuff out there. The community is very sharing. And then I think one of my top tips about making the skills lab and clinical skills successful is to have what I would call a clinical skills sub-curriculum. So this means you have clinical skills taught throughout the whole 5 years. So this is our clinical skills sub-curriculum. So year 1, what we teach, what we assess. So animal handling primarily in years 1 and 2. Then year 3, we're moving on to surgical skills, anesthesia, physical exam, reproduction, etc. And an OSCE. Year 4, further skills. These are all taught in the skills lab. And that is all leading into year 5 to prepare them for rotations, where it will be a workplace-based assessment that is being used, like ADOPS. So all of this is timetabled. So there are scheduled practical times for all students to do all these skills. It is assessed because assessment drives learning, but also links to being able to demonstrate this to EVE. And the skills lab is open access because the students need to be able to practice. Now, this is with models primarily. Taught classes in the skills labs with models, and what they are aiming to do is to prepare students for live animal practicals and the clinics. So I think it's quite important to put those two together to ensure that the preparation is taking place in the skills lab at a time where the students can practice, be assessed, and then move on to the live animal situation. Building that is an important point. It does take time, and we picked off some of the most important areas first, but ended up with a complete clinical skills subcurriculum. So my final point about clinical skills labs is, how do we measure the impact? Because you're going to need space, you're going to need equipment, you're going to need people. This all amounts to cost, and also you're going to need space in the curriculum. So how do we kind of justify or measure the impact? Well, the first thing is clinical skills labs and clinical skills linked to 2 of the EAEVE accreditation standards, 3 and 8. And with a clinical skills lab, you will be able to demonstrate improved student competencies, because you will show through your OSCEs, so the objective structured clinical examinations, that the students have acquired a whole set of practical and technical and clinical skills. There's also outcomes assessment, so gathering stakeholder feedback, so from employers and recent graduates, and surveying them, where they'll be able to demonstrate that now students can perform clinical skills in the workplace as employees better, but they can also reflect on any skills where perhaps they aren't as good as they should be, and therefore you can integrate that into your teaching in the clinical skills lab and other parts of the curriculum. There's also a growing body of evidence and research studies around clinical skills and clinical skills labs. So many of the models now have been validated. That means they have been shown that students trained on the model will then perform the skill or the procedure better in a real situation. It's a way of researching expert performance. So what do we do? How do we do these skills? And learning more about how novices actually learn. And all of this will inform our teaching practices. And JVME, as has already been mentioned, Journal of Veterinary Medical Education, now regularly includes either special issue or papers related to clinical skills and clinical skills labs. So that's the end of my first talk. I'm going to move on to the second talk now, but if you have questions about that one at this stage, please feel free to jot them down or type them in the chat, or of course we can come to them. Please type them in at the end as well. And I would just like to say a thank you to the Bristol Clinical Skills Lab team, who are an amazing group of people who I've worked with, who support the Skills Lab, the student teaching, teach the students, and also run and assess in the OSCEs. They're an amazing team. So my second talk is on flipped classroom. And in this short talk, I will be explaining about flipped classrooms, but I think this is incredibly timely, because we've all been through the pandemic, and so we've all had to flip. And that means that building on our skills and reflecting on flipped classroom this is a really good time to do it. So I will touch on what a flipped classroom is and why we should use flipped classrooms, because the good news is there is a large body of evidence that taking a flipped classroom approach has many benefits for learning. Okay, so it is a good time to be flipping the classroom, because as a result of COVID-19, we all had to move to a blended learning approach. So moving away from our traditional curriculum, sometimes having to go primarily, if not fully online, but definitely going blended, so that we could use the face-to-face time that we did have as effectively as possible. So because we've used it so much more over the last year, we all have recent experience of flipped and blended learning. We have the skills, pedagogically and technologically, and we have resources because we've been designing the online part of this, and many of these are reusable. So there's very good reason to focus in on flipped classroom and do it now, do it even more going forward. So I just wanted to take a step back and think, so what is a flipped classroom? And it's sometimes talked about as a reordering of classroom and at-home activities. So where before we would be in a lecture or giving a lecture, and then afterwards the students will read through their notes or perhaps do some homework. Whereas in the flipped classroom, we've swapped that around. So some of what was previously in the lecture or in a practical is repurposed and done by the students in advance, usually online. So they're doing some preparation. And then when they come through doing that flipped material, they'll be well prepared to come to the face-to-face class, whether that's a seminar or a practical, etc. And in that seminar or practical, we're going to build upon the core knowledge that they have acquired through the flipped material. And that means we can build their higher order skills. So we're going to be doing problem solving activities, etc., in the face-to-face class now. So I'm sure you know what flipped activities are, what sort of resources and materials we'll be using. But just to summarize, it can be recorded lectures, although those should be divided into smaller chunks. So it's not about taking your 1 hour, 50-minute lecture and just speaking over your slides. Chunking it up in between the sections, perhaps posing questions or pausing for the students to reflect, make notes, etc., rather than just a long recording. Another useful way to do it is if you have something like a diagram or an image, to record a voiceover of you explaining some of the key points. Perhaps if you think of a radiograph, and you can move the mouse over that as you're speaking to explain to the student the key points. Videos are used quite a lot in flipped activities. There are some very good ones on YouTube, so you may be able to repurpose those or filmed by yourself. Then it may be that you're actually just pointing the students to reading a section of a book that is relevant, gives them the underpinning knowledge for what you're then going to explore in more detail during the face-to-face, case-based, problem-based activities. Or perhaps you want them to go to a paper and review or critique that paper, and then you will discuss that in the face-to-face session. Most flipped activities do include some form of self-assessment, so allowing the students to self-assess themselves against the learning outcomes for the flipped activity, so quizzes, that sort of thing. Now, in flipped classroom design, it's been shown that using what they sometimes call signposting or short pieces of text around the flipped resources that you have uploaded really helps. So this is directions for the students. So it will start with what the learning objectives are for the flipped session, but also for each resource that you have posted, whether that's a video, a section of a book or whatever, that you will explain what that activity is and what the students should be doing in that activity, what they should be looking for, what the focus should be, etc. And then finally, as you close the flipped classroom, you do need to link it to the face-to-face seminar. So the students are on a journey, if you like, and know where they're going next. So how the flipped classroom will have prepared them and what the expectations are for the face-to-face component. Another way of looking at it is to use Bloom's taxonomy. So I'm sure you're all aware of Bloom's taxonomy. We use it when we're writing our learning outcomes. We use it when we're writing our assessment to ensure that we're not just assessing knowledge, but also assessing the higher order skills. And that, of course, is particularly important when we're moving to more authentic assessment and in successful open book assessment, which has already been mentioned. So in the context of flipped classroom, with Bloom's taxonomy, the flipped component tends to focus on the lower levels. So that is remembering, understanding. So it will give them the core knowledge for the face-to-face activity. It could be about key concepts and they're developing their understanding around those key concepts. And so then when they come to the face-to-face activity, we will be doing problem-solving activities, maybe case-based learning, where they get the opportunity to use the knowledge that they have acquired during the flipped classroom and apply that knowledge to solve problems. They can also use that knowledge and the key concepts they have acquired in analytical evaluation, etc. So, why should we use flipped classroom? Well, fortunately, there are some very good educational reasons to use it. And on this slide, if we look at the grey boxes at the top, so this is quite a common and traditional approach. It's certainly the education that I went through. So we had a lecture, it was teacher-led, and I, as a student, I have to admit, was fairly passive. And then at some point, I or the student reads the notes, reviews it, and quite often that is driven by an impending exam. But research has shown that that kind of approach, where it's teacher-led, students are passive, and they're driven to rote learning for an exam, actually leads to quite superficial learning. Whereas, if you have a flipped approach where the flipped classroom activity, the student has prepared the core knowledge, concepts, etc., and then the face-to-face activity has taken them to the higher order skills through problem solving and so on, they're actively engaged, and that will lead to deeper learning. And then the very good news about flipped classroom is actually now there is a body of research evidence that flipped classrooms work. So there have been a lot of studies on this over the last 10 years. In fact, in some areas, there have been so many studies that people have been able to do systematic reviews of all the studies in their subject area. So if we take some of these reviews, what have they shown? So the benefits for students include significant improvement in examination results and skills when you are in a flipped classroom curriculum compared to a lecture-based curriculum. Also, through the flipped approach, there is increased student satisfaction. They like the flexibility of learning, so the online component being more flexible when they do it, how they do it, what speed they do it, and it can lead to greater engagement overall in the students' learning. There are some examples from veterinary medicine. So there was a study that compared a flipped classroom curriculum with a traditional lecture-based curriculum, and the flipped classroom approach led to significantly higher grades and higher student satisfaction. Similarly for clinical skills, so flipped classroom is also done preparing students for going into the clinical skills lab and doing clinical skills. And this study showed that with a flipped approach, the students' performance in OSCEs improved. And then there has relatively recently been a large study in medicine, so a systematic review of the literature comparing a flipped classroom curriculum with a lecture-based curriculum. And what they found when they collated all that research, the overwhelming evidence is with a flipped approach, students have greater academic performance, there's higher student satisfaction, and that also the students were reaching higher level learning outcomes, so higher up Bloom's taxonomy. So this apply, evaluate, etc., which of course is exactly what we want. So I think it's fair to say now is definitely the time to be building on our experience of flipped classrooms. We've had the skills, we have the resources, we have the experience, but even more important, there is a huge body of evidence of the many benefits for student learning. So let's capitalize on where we are with flipped classrooms. Don't let it go with the pandemic, let it go forward. Let's build on where we are and make the very most of it. So that ends the second presentation on flipped classrooms. And I think hopefully leading quite nicely on from that is my third talk. So my third talk is about case-based learning. And I will provide a short overview of what I mean by case-based learning, just to ensure that we're all on the same page of this. And then what I've used in this presentation is an example of how we've used case-based learning in year 1 to talk you through what case-based learning can do, how you can do it, and then we can look at the benefits of case-based learning. So obviously, we're all using clinical cases in the curriculum a lot. Rotations, external practicum training, that's all about clinical cases. But we're also using them in our lectures. So cases are the example that illustrates the discipline, the condition, etc. But case-based learning as a pedagogical approach is slightly different. It is defined as a comprehensive use of cases prior to clinical rotations. So this is usually in every year of the curriculum, and it can, in some medical curricula and veterinary curricula, become the pedagogical approach. Case-based learning is what the curriculum is all about, right from day 1, all the way to the point at which the students are ready for the clinics. So the reason that case-based learning is used is it helps students develop their clinical reasoning skills. And trying to learn clinical reasoning, particularly the first time in a clinic when you're faced with the animal, the owner, all of the complications of the workplace, is really, really difficult. Or even if you have some fundamental clinical reasoning but haven't had a chance to practice it very much, it can be really difficult to then try and reason when you're in front of the client and the animal. So it's really good idea to start much, much earlier in the curriculum. And case-based learning is a format or a framework, if you like, that allows students to develop their clinical reasoning skills right from year 1. There are some other benefits of case-based learning. By having it early in the curriculum, then it does improve student understanding of basic science concepts and how those basic sciences are relevant to the clinical work later on. So it shows the clinical relevance of subjects that are taught in the early years. So what does case-based learning look like? How can we do it? These days, it usually does start with a flip component. So the students will do some preparation that may focus particularly on the underpinning knowledge for the case, some of the basic concepts. And then how the case-based learning actually happens, there are a number of options for that. So small group work, so the students working in a small group, maybe 5, 6, 8 students, with facilitators who help with the questions and the problem solving. So they will be working through the case, and this will be facilitated by the academics, clinicians in the room. You can also, however, do it in large groups, and some of us are in a position where actually having access to enough small group teaching rooms is a challenge, if not impossible sometimes. And so actually you can do case-based learning in a lecture theatre. So you can have the whole cohort of students there, but you do need them to be actively engaged. So thanks to technology, there are what we call audience response systems, the clickers, or these days on the student's mobile phone, so that they can be voting, answering questions, contributing in quite a variety of ways as you go through the case. So they're actively engaged in it, even though you're running it in a lecture theatre and in a large group. And then another type of case-based learning is through virtual patients. So these are complete cases that are set up in an online situation. The students work through it, usually self-directed, although can do it in groups. Some of the more sophisticated virtual patients can actually do what they call branching. So depending on the decision the student makes, for example, what is the most likely diagnosis or what treatment are you going to choose, then the case will branch, and the consequences of that can go and will go in different directions. So now what I thought I'd do to illustrate case-based learning is just to take you through an example. So in our curriculum review, we integrated more case-based learning in all of the years before final year. So year 1, 2, 3, and 4. There was a proactive and planned strategy to bring cases into all of those years. So the example that I'm going to show you is actually one that is used in year 1, semester 1. It is run as a whole class activity. So we did have a challenge around small group teaching rooms, and therefore for year 1, it's run in a lecture theatre as a whole class. But as well as using an audience response system, the students are at times have to work in pairs. So there is discussion going on and an element of group work within the large group. So the case that I'm going to take you through is used to highlight to our first years the relevance of the subjects they're doing at the time. So this one is part of the gastrointestinal system course. And so the subjects they'll be doing at the time include anatomy, physiology, biochemistry. So we have Mr. Simmons' dairy cow. It's cow number 531. She's part of Park Farm Holstein Friesians. And I just want to introduce you to the menu on the right. So all of these cases have the logical approach explicitly as a menu, if you like, on the right, because we want the students to have this framework embedded from a very early stage so that when they actually need to use the logical approach and their clinical reasoning skills, this framework and this sequence and why you do it this way will be second nature to them because they have seen it so much. And as we go through the case, you will see that that blue circle moves down the menu on the right. And just a spoiler alert, I'm going to skip through this case to show you some of the key points. But this cow 531 has a left displaced abomasum. So the ping, if you like, noise over the caudal ribs on the left-hand side of the abdomen. So we do a complete case, even though they're first years, we go right through the case. That's what the case-based learning literature would tell you you need to do. So we start by setting the scene. And you'll see in the top left of that slide, there's the letter C. So these sessions are co-facilitated by clinicians who do the slides that are marked C and deal the discussion and the questions, and S when it's one of the scientists, the basic science teachers, taking over, because we integrate the clinical material and the basic science, as I will illustrate. But we also make it authentic and real. For example, it starts with the phone ringing. So your receptionist takes a call from Mr. Simmons that he wants you to come and see a sick cow. Or, in my experience, usually these are your on the routine fertility visit and the farmer says, while you're here, could you come and have a look at a sick cow? So we now move down our menu on the right, so the logical sequence, and we describe the signalment. And this is a Holstein Friesian cow, third lactation. She's part of a 200 cow herd and relatively high yielding. So on this slide, we will start explaining to the students why the signalment is important and why they need to know this information and how it might affect the following steps in the case. And linked to that, we often test them on some fairly basic knowledge about the husbandry system. So here we're asking them, how old is a third lactation Holstein Friesian cow? How old is she likely to be? So they then get their mobile phones out or their clickers out, and they would vote for one of these options. And then we would explain how you know how old the cow is. We then go presenting complaint, but I'm going to skip over down to history. So with the history, we often pose them the question of, so you've heard this is what the farmer has said in the presenting complaint about this cow. So she's gone off her food a bit. She's a few weeks calved, etc., etc. What questions do you want to ask Mr. Simmons? And this is where they work in pairs or small groups, and they get a couple of minutes to jot down their questions. And then following that, we will ask them either to type in their questions or to vote for a series of questions. So they get actively involved in thinking about what information do I need from the farmer about this cow. We would then move on to the clinical examination, and we would describe the clinical examination and what the findings are. But here we've had the opportunity to now link with the anatomy. So the scientist takes over, and as well as, of course, picking up the ping over the left side and caudal ribs, they've done a rectal palpation, and we want to know if they actually know from their anatomy where they would be feeling the rumen when they think of the anatomy from the standing animal from the tail. And then what we get them to do is, having taken the history and done the clinical examination, we actually get them to generate a problem list. And they'll have a few minutes to go back through the history and the clinical exam and pull out what they think the problems are. And then we put up what we think is on the problem list, and they get to vote for all the ones that they got. Sometimes there are ones that they miss. Sometimes also they have come up with problems that we haven't. So they get the opportunity to discuss that and share that with us. But what this is doing is very early on emphasizing to them how important it is to get an accurate history and do a thorough clinical examination, because otherwise you're going to end up with a problem list that isn't actually accurate. And all the following steps in your clinical reasoning and your logical approach depend on you having generated an accurate problem list. So then they will go through differential diagnosis, diagnostic tests, test results, and come to a final diagnosis, and then on to a treatment plan. So I'm just going to bring back in, this time it's the biochemistry. So one of the problems was that sweet smell on the breath, the ketones. So we now hand over to the biochemist, who links that with the biochemistry that they have been learning in parallel with this case. And now let's jump forward to the treatment plan. There are two options here, to either roll the cow or to do surgery. And here we've brought in some of the professionalism around health and safety, because if you're going to either roll a cow or operate on her, you need to think of the safety of yourself and the farmer. So they get a couple of minutes to jot down some of what they think might be the health and safety issues. And then they can compare them with our list. With this one, I can tell you that we always come up with more health and safety issues than they do. That's the benefit of hindsight, and probably not thinking of as many health and safety issues as you should. And then another thing linked to the treatment, we explore the rolling of the cow, but we also explain the surgery, so that will link to the anatomy, but we've also used it as an opportunity to look at their technical skills to ensure that they're actually holding a scalpel properly. So they will all have a burrow or pen or something, and we get them to hold that, show their neighbour, and then they vote for how they're holding it, because we want them right from the beginning to be holding a scalpel as a surgeon would, because they are holding the scalpel in the dissection room. So we're bringing in many of the aspects of what they're learning. So what are the benefits of case-based learning? Just in summary, it's a really active learning approach, and that, of course, will promote deeper learning. It integrates basic and clinical science, so it shows how you need the knowledge of anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, etc., because that underpins your ability to diagnose, treat, and manage the cases. So it explicitly makes that link for them. We bring in professional skills, sometimes financial considerations, etc. And also, and very importantly, very early on, they're beginning to develop their clinical reasoning skills. And it's very explicit how that logical approach works. Here are a few quotes. So the students like that it showed them the relevance of the science. They enjoy it. They feel motivated. The flipped classroom, so they are doing some preparation. That really helps. And then I really like this quote from a clinician, the bottom right. After we had embedded case-based learning in years 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the first students from that curriculum came into rotations, this clinician said, at the start of final year, they're now much better at clinical reasoning. less of a rabbit in the headlights. So that's really exactly what we were wanting to achieve with regard to the clinical reasoning, but also emphasizing the importance of the basic science. So that's a whistle-stop tour of case-based learning. If you have questions on that, please do type them in now, or we can take them at the end. So my final talk, this is just a short talk on what I think is an area that is really growing internationally, and that is evidence-based veterinary medicine. Now, I'm not saying that we aren't practicing evidence-based veterinary medicine and haven't been doing so for a long time, but actually explicitly including it in the curriculum is actually relatively new, and it's really, really growing. The interest in this and the resources to support it are growing very rapidly. So in this short talk on evidence-based veterinary medicine, I am going to define what we mean by EBVM, just so that we're all on the same page. Then go through a structure that we use, the 5 A's. This comes from medicine, evidence-based medicine, but equally well applies to evidence-based veterinary medicine. Then think about why we might want to include more EBVM in the curriculum and do it more explicitly, so it's clearer where it is. Show some examples of how that can be done, and then the good news is there are lots of free resources out there for teaching EBVM. So there's lots of stuff that people have developed for student learning, for practitioner learning, that's available for you to freely access and download. So I'm going to start here with the definition, and this comes from the Centre for Evidence-based Veterinary Medicine in University of Nottingham in the UK. And they have defined EBVM, or evidence-based veterinary medicine, as the use of the best relevant evidence in conjunction, of course, with our clinical expertise, so that we are able to make the best possible decisions about a particular patient. And importantly, obviously, the circumstances of each patient and the circumstances and values of the owner or carer must also be considered when making an evidence-based decision. That might be their financial circumstances or other circumstances that we need to consider. I also like the Venn diagram on the bottom right. This comes from medicine, so EBM, but it's equally applicable to evidence-based veterinary medicine, where EBVM sits at the heart of combining the best available and relevant scientific evidence with our clinical expertise, that's ourselves, our colleagues, and so on, and the owner and animal circumstances. So one of the frameworks that is quite commonly used in EBVM and evidence-based medicine is this 5 A's framework, where we start with the clinical problem or situation that we find ourselves in. So it might be a new treatment is being advertised to us, a new drug. Is that better than what we're doing at the moment? What about a new diagnostic test? Is that better than the test we have available to ourselves at the minute? And what the first step we have to do is to formulate that clinical question into a structured question. And one of the approaches used is something called the Pico, because if we can be really specific in our question, then it will make it easier for us to find the evidence to answer the question. So the Pico is the patient, so what the animal is and the condition. Then the intervention, so that might be drug A, the comparator drug B, and the outcome, a better recovery rate, for example. Having formulated the clinical problem or situation that we are looking at into a structured question as a Pico, we can then use that to enter search terms into a database in order to find the evidence. So that's the research studies and papers. Having got those papers and studies, step 3 is appraise. That's evaluating that evidence. So we're reviewing the studies and papers that we've identified to determine its relevance to our clinical question and the quality, the level of that evidence. And there are some really good toolkits out there for different study types that give us a framework for evaluating studies. Then we will come to what's often called a clinical bottom line about that evidence, which we use to then decide what changes we are going to make in the clinical workplace. So that will involve discussing it with our colleagues and deciding how, if and how we will apply the evidence. And then finally, completing the circle is we need to assess the outcome. If we've made a change, was it effective? Was it beneficial? And we need to have a way of determining that. So if I take an example here, this is a situation, you're a new graduate and a dairy herd has an increasing rate of mastitis cases, and the farmer has decided that using injectable as well as intramammary antibiotics would be a good idea. Now, obviously, as a responsible new graduate, you want to be responsible in your use of antimicrobials. You will quite likely go back and discuss it with other veterinarians in the practice. But even so, you just think, well, what is the evidence? Can I make an evidence-based decision about this? So you decide that you will go and look for the evidence. So I'm basing this on a knowledge summary that has been done and is published in Veterinary Evidence. And so the Pico here was dairy cows with clinical mastitis, the patient, dairy cows with clinical mastitis. The intervention is systemic and intramammary antimicrobials, which is what the farmer thinks or wants to do, compared to what you are actually leaning towards, the comparator, which is just the intramammary antimicrobials. We are here talking about cows that are not clinically sick. Okay, this is just an increase in mastitis cases. And we're looking, our outcome is clinical cure rate. So will the addition of injectable systemic antimicrobials effectively improve the cure rate? So those terms are put into the database, a number of papers come out. Those are evaluated depending on the study type. There are different templates, frameworks that allow you to evaluate that evidence. It obviously needs to be relevant to your clinical situation, and you're looking for the quality of that evidence. In this case, from that knowledge summary, the clinical bottom line was that in cattle with clinical mastitis and an absence of systemic sites. So we're not talking about the E. coli cow that is really, really sick. We're talking about an overall increase in incidence of mastitis, but without systemic sites. So there was no evidence that combining systemic and intramammary antimicrobial therapy improves the clinical cure rates compared to intramammary antimicrobial therapy alone. So that's what you found from the evidence. You then will take that back to the practice team and to the farmer, and effectively the application of this evidence is that we're going to use intramammary antimicrobials alone. And you'll keep some records here to see what the outcome is. Obviously, you will be discussing prevention of mastitis, but this is just using an example to take us around the 5 A's. So, why are we including more in our curriculum? Well, our students are future graduates and clinicians, and if they have a structured approach to using evidence effectively, it can really help them inform and improve their decision-making in clinical practice. Another reason is actually accreditation. So very, very recently, the American accreditation increased the evidence on EBVM skills. So there are 2 sections, 2 parts of one of the standards that has placed a greater emphasis explicitly on EBVM skills in the curriculum. But it's not just about clinicians. Actually, learning more about the processes and skills associated with EBVM, a really good place for people who are planning to undertake research as their career. It gives you many of the basic underpinning skills that you will need. So where are we going to put it in the curriculum? It can be a specific course, it can be integrated in other courses. Some people do it undergraduate, some people do it postgraduate, some people do continuing education. And the image on the right shows how we embedded it throughout the 5 years of the curriculum. So starting with just asking a question in year 1, then using databases to acquire it, thinking about quality of those studies, further appraisal in year 3, and then putting it all together as a knowledge summary, generating, asking a question, acquiring the information, appraising some papers, and then finally, you're going to see the application of EBVM. Questions you might want to ask yourself is, what stages would you put EBVM into the curriculum? Is it undergraduate, postgraduate? What is already there? Because it will be already there, but how could you perhaps do it more and make it more explicit? Well, the good news is there are lots of free resources and there are research projects going on in this area. So it's very much an evolving field. So I apologize for this very busy slide, but it shows you some of the free resources. We have been working with RCVS Knowledge and generated something called EBVM Learning. RCVS Knowledge are the charity partner of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. Their course, which is modelled around the 5 A's, is free. They also have Veterinary Evidence, an open access journal, which publishes the knowledge summaries, which are these syntheses of the first 3 steps of the EBVM cycle. The American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges also funded a group to develop a toolkit about how to integrate research and EBVM in the curriculum. And just to show it's very international, but also at the weekend, myself and a colleague did a conference presentation and some workshop activities on EBVM for the International Veterinary Student Association in Indonesia. And we had over 100 students attend that. So that concludes my 4th and final talk. I think, I hope that those were some areas that are helpful to you, and I'm very happy now to take questions. Please type them in the chat if you haven't already. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And so it's time for question now. There is one. Yeah, George, we can read the question. Okay, it's just a comment. Thank you, George. So if somebody has a question, I have one actually, because different teaching methods in my mind will require different proportion between time that the teacher is in class and the students devote his time to study. And these proportions will be different among courses, maybe of the first year, the second year. So this will imply a lot of planning to schedule lectures. And it is not possible because in Italy maybe we have this traditional way that we just are we hone the knowledge of our discipline, so we just go in the class and say something, and this is completely impossible if you want to plan a curriculum using different approaches. And so the scheduling should be made, and the planning of your course should be made a lot in advance, and the flexibility, of course, will decrease. What do you think about this? It is difficult to manage something like this, or when you start doing in a way, things will be like frozen forever, and because it is impossible to change things.
So that's a very good question and a very good point, and there isn't an easy answer or solution. So anyone who's led a major curriculum review, and both myself and Susan have done that, and I'm sure others on the call have been involved in these sorts of things, it's really difficult. But I think the accreditation has helped, because one of the criteria now is that you have to demonstrate that you have reviewed your curriculum at least every 7 years. So the status quo is not going to get you through accreditation anymore. So that's quite helpful. But also, I think, it does need, Susan referred to a curriculum committee, and I was the program manager, if you like. So it does need that sort of strategic oversight in order that you can bring in these sorts of changes. So it is moving away from the individual to the program and the curriculum committee. And the accreditation, again, will be looking at these sorts of committees and approaches. I would also say, however, that, there is this saying that you can't eat an elephant in one bite. And I chose, when I was leading a major curriculum review, I did also choose to implement some of the changes that I've shown you there in areas where I thought it would be achievable and have a big impact. So the clinical skills lab, for example, we put it into year 3, even in the old curriculum, made space for it because our students needed better technical, surgical, animal handling, animal technique skills. And that made such a huge difference to them on external practicum training and in the clinics. Also, with the flipped approach and the case-based approach, there were people who were keen to do it. So I went for that first. But in the long term, this does need to be a program-wide curriculum committee, if you like, and whole university school approach.
So I think this last thing you said fit with the question that Monica was asking. Monica asks if you think that these innovative teaching methods can be applied just on individual subjects, or they need to be planned on the entire curriculum from the beginning. So
I think it's a little bit of both. So you can't just wait for a major change to bring this in. And actually it helps if you do integrate some of it into your existing curriculum, because you yourselves are developing the skills and experience in preparation for when the curriculum review, this 7-year review, if you like, takes place. It's very rewarding, I have to say. I mean, introducing your skills lab, I mean, the flipped approach is so topical because we all have the skills at the minute. So we're building on, something that's very timely there, I think. And the impact of case-based learning and clinical reasoning, it's so hard to learn and it does take time. So bringing it in early and embedding it throughout makes such a difference for the students when they're in the clinics and for the clinicians who are then working with them.
We are keeping a question from the chat. So Gualtiero, Laura, Anya, wait 1 second. Wait. There was Rosangela that would like to ask a question. So I asked her to speak since she's here with us.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you and to hear your speech, Sarah. I'd just like to share with you and all the participants a recent experience about flipped classroom. During the last year, strengthened by the pandemic, we applied the flipped approach to all our courses. And an interesting finding was that, as opposite to what I was thinking, teachers quickly adapted to this model, whereas students find it somewhat tiring, and by the end of the semester their participation was significantly decreased. So in your opinion, which is the best strategy to stimulate students' active learning? To start from the first year, don't give them any other alternatives? Thank you so much.
So obviously, we were all put in a situation where we had to, if you like, push this into every year. We had been doing some flipped classroom before this, so we had a project to do a research study around it. And it did work better with the first years, I have to say, because they knew no different and they got the most out of it. But I think we're in, again, why it's timely is we are in a place where you know, the digital literacy and digital skills of everybody is so much better. A few tips I would share is when I introduced both case-based learning and we brought more flipped classroom in, we did protect time in the students' timetable for this activity. And that actually came from the students, and there are a number of reasons for it. One is if they have protected time between 9 and 5, then other things don't come in, okay? They don't have to do it between 9 and 5, but they're not then doing it late at night when they're tired because they've had a full day. Secondly, one of the reasons the students wanted it was it helped them with their time management, because some of the lack of engagement was they just weren't quite sure when they were meant to be doing it, what they were meant to be doing, and how long, if you like. Whereas if you put it in, say, a few days or a week before, you know, the face-to-face activity, then it comes up on their calendar and, okay, I should be doing this now or today or this evening, and this is approximately how much time. Also, I mentioned the signposting part, and that is emerging. This is where you do include bits of text that explicitly state, you know, you don't just shove up a video or a lecture recording. There are a few sentences that explain what they're doing and why, and also linking it to the face-to-face activity. And when you compare a course that just has material put on it versus one that is much better designed with these little bits of text, the engagement from the students is very different. It's low if there's just stuff shoved up there, especially if it's not very well designed, and it's much, much better if they have like a storyboard or a journey that takes them through the flipped activity.
Thank you so much.
Laura is asking the same question from the other side. So any tips on how to convince teaching staff to change?
So I mean, this comes up repeatedly, and I expect Susan is smiling and some others are smiling as this question comes up. I think starting with early adopters is always a good place because they're enthusiastic and they become champions for you. And then many others will come on board. But we still have a few people who, you know, for whatever reason haven't engaged or don't truly follow the pedagogy that we want to adopt. Just as a tip, one of the things I found when I was bringing in a major curriculum review was I did have, if you like, almost support staff. They were actually recent graduates. Other people might use learning technologists who work with these members of staff to help them develop the new resources. Because for some of these people, it's not just that they don't want to do it, but time or the know-how. And if you can just take away some of the time commitment, provide some of the know-how. So the case-based learning, although the staff owned it, if you like, I had these recent graduates who were actually creating it for them and working very closely with them. And that really helped. It kind of took away a little bit of an unseen barrier in that time and know-how were the real barrier, not so much that they didn't want to do it if I could help and facilitate them. But there are still a few who remain skeptical. But as the outcomes start to speak for themselves, that also becomes a very convincing way of converting people and helping people, if you like, get on the bus, as they say.
There is another question from Gualtiero, and I would like to ask also the other speakers and our invited speaker for this afternoon, and Susan, if they want to add something, please feel free to join this discussion that is very stimulating.
So shall I take the question on rough idea of timetable? So case-based learning, it does take quite a lot of time and resource, and there is actually quite a huge range of how you can do it. The one I showed you was for first years in a lecture theatre because we didn't have small group teaching rooms for those years, and we did it in PowerPoint. It was led by PowerPoint with the clickers, but that they were developed by this small group of recent graduates who were developing them with the clinicians. I think it probably took us about a week of work for each of the case-based learning resources we developed. To go to the other extreme, when I first started looking into case-based learning when I was in London, some of the medical schools would put tens of thousands of dollars into one case. We clearly don't have that sort of money. You can do it much, much cheaper than that. But time, I think, is the main one. And if you can get somebody to help a bit with that, whether it's an instructional designer or a recent graduate, that will help. The sessions themselves tend to run over 2 or 3 hours, preparation beforehand, and then co-facilitated or small group work higher up the curriculum, the students doing that. And there are some online ones that they can do as well in their own time. Hopefully that answers your question.
There is another question from Anya. No, I think Dels.
On EBVM. Yes, yeah. So I speak from personal experience because I feel like I'm a student when it comes to EBVM. I think it's really, really hard. I've been working on developing EBVM learning resources for 5 or 6 years now, and I am still learning. I think it's really, really tough, which is partly why we embedded it across the curriculum, because it does take them time and they need to develop, parts of the skill at a time. I think it does then help if you can make it relevant and applicable. So that's why we brought in knowledge summaries and clinical scenarios. We've recently developed some clinical case scenarios that take them through the 5 A's. The good news is, for us as staff or teachers, is the number of free and really good quality resources that are out there through the likes of RCVS Knowledge, the charity partner of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, and through the University of Nottingham publish a lot of their material as well. So it's a very open access community. That's good news. It doesn't shortcut all the effort, time and skill to learn it. If anyone knows how to do it quicker, that would be great. But I just think the reality is it's a difficult topic. It's a big topic and it takes time.
Stefano would like to...
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Baillie. A very, very interesting presentation. I really appreciated it. I've been using myself a combination of flipped classroom approach and case-based scenario over the last few years, and I think your words were excellent. Your thoughts and suggestions. Well, when we use these innovative teaching methods, these globally take a lot of time away from lecturing. So you end up having less lecturing time, which means that you can, deal with fewer topics during your course. Obviously, some topics are dealt with, when you do a flipped classroom session or something else. But still, the classical lecturing time is decreased, so the students are exposed to fewer topics in class. So that raises the question, should they be examined only on what they are taught, or is there a minimum set of information that you still require, even if you didn't lecture about it? Because that's a big discussion that we have in our country at the moment. Most teachers still think that what they did not deal with in class, they are not entitled to ask for it or to question students in the exam. So I'd like to know what's your opinion about it and what's your approach.
So that's a great, I think several questions in there actually, but these questions are very relevant and valid to the challenges that we all face. Firstly, with constructive alignment of your teaching, assessment and learning, then your assessment is going to link to your learning outcomes. And so deciding what those learning outcomes are and how they map to the competencies is a good place to start, I think, to help identify what does need to be taught and assessed and what is perhaps more nice to know, or even postgraduate, or perhaps in electives, for example, if they're going into it in more depth. So yeah, I think there is a... Susan, do you want to chip in on the assessment side of it?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, actually, and I was thinking about it in relation to some conversations we've had here, because we have exactly these conversations. The students say, well, if it wasn't in the lecture material, you can't examine us on it, it's not fair, kind of thing. And I think partly I take the point there because our curriculum is so full of stuff that we have to draw the line somewhere from a student well-being point of view. But it's leaving us to have some conversations around perhaps moving to more of a system of a pass-fail assessment around the real core material. But then if we want to give the really best students a chance to show off and explore, by, going to the literature and finding out more examples, then maybe we could have a sort of two-step assessment process around basic competency and then the extra material. Because I think sometimes academic staff can forget what it's like from the student perspective to be getting all the different courses and all that material, and so an individual might think, well, I'll just add in an extra lecture here, or I'll expect them to read this extra material. But if every staff member is doing that, it becomes overwhelming. So I agree with Sarah, it's about the mapping and being very explicit about the learning outcomes. And I think certainly for us in our school at the moment, we are quite constrained in terms of our assessment, and we will make sure that we're assessing them around what they have actually been explicitly taught, or what their learning outcomes actually say, because we think it takes us into a bad place in terms of student well-being if we make that too flexible. I think elsewhere in the university it's a different matter where you don't have quite such a busy curriculum. I think that would be my opinion, but I think it's a great question, great for debate.
Just to go back to where you were talking about, having a flipped approach versus lecture, just to reassure everybody, there is a big evidence base on flipped classroom, not just because of COVID. It goes back about 10 years. And so both medical and in other topics, and including actually a paper in veterinary medicine, where they, using the same exam, comparing a lecture-based cohort with a flipped cohort, where you might say they're not getting all the lots and lots of detailed knowledge, the flipped cohort performed better in the same exam. So this was an exam that had been running before to assess the lecture-based approach, and the flipped cohort have the better exam results. So I think you can be reassured that actually through the flipped approach, whether the students go and discover some more of the knowledge, but you are getting the basic knowledge there and moving them then up Bloom's taxonomy to the higher order skills. And as a result of that, they will actually perform better than a lecture-based approach. So I think that's really reassuring. That is coming through over and over again. It's in the systematic reviews, which are reviewing the series of research studies in this area. So I think it's reassuring. We all like evidence, we like the science, so it's reassuring to know that the evidence is actually backing up what our instinct might tell us might go the other way.
There is a question from Gualtiero that is about the abomasum displacement in the first year, and he's asking how the students can cope with this information, where it is very different from what we are traditionally. I teach anatomy, so I can understand the question.
Yeah, so that's again a really good question, and we set expectations. Actually, I've given you a very short version of it, and there is an introduction to case-based learning where we set the expectations and or what our outcomes are going to be, and we do make it very clear to them that we're using the cases so that they will appreciate the relevance and importance of the basic science in year one. So that is made very clear to them. There is actually a slide that comes up at the beginning of every case that reinforces that is what it's about. It's not about the clinical. But if you look at the medical literature, if you don't include all the details of the case, admittedly quite superficially when we're coming to differential diagnosis and so on, the students sort of feel cheated, you know, that why can't they have the whole case? And the whole case really does motivate them and show them how relevant and important their basic science is to becoming what they want to be, which is this person who can do all the steps. So when we come to the things like the differential diagnosis and some of the diagnostic tests, that will be quite short, unless, for example, a diagnostic test is linking back to the biochemistry they're doing at the minute, the liver enzymes or something like that. So actually, they really enjoy it. It motivates them. They aren't overwhelmed by the clinical material, but we do explicitly set the expectations around that. This is about your basic science. It's not about the clinical stuff. But do explain why the clinical aspect is there. So I hope that reassures you.
Okay. There is another question. Luca, please.
Yeah, for Sarah or Susan, if you like. It's a bit politically incorrect, my question, but as a teacher, I feel that a part of our students, I would say 1/3, is quite flat in front of the application of new methods. So my question is, to which extent the way you select and enroll student, which is very different from our way, is relevant to the effective delivery of innovative teaching approaches?
Who wants that one, Sarah? So that's a great question. I think this is about admissions and to what extent the students we choose impacts their, I guess, the way that they might be flexible in the face of different teaching methods. Am I correct? Is that what you mean? It's about a sort of yeah. Exactly. I think regardless of what, because I don't think anybody has really nailed veterinary admissions yet, and I don't think there's any good evidence actually that anything we do there is making that much of a difference. So I think to me this is a question about transitions to university and how you set students' expectations really early on in the course. One of the things that we are planning to do with our new curriculum review, which we had to park because of the pandemic, but is to completely reframe the first 6 weeks of first year about not spoon feeding them, about expectations, about getting them inducted into the way that they're going to have to think and be, and flexibility and so on. So I think that transitions to the programme and setting expectations early can probably help with that quite a lot, because I don't think that in reality we've got any good evidence that any particular selection procedure is actually that much better than another, and I still think there's lots of work and research needing to be done about admissions. That is certainly quite a hot topic in the UK and in North America as well. So I think the curriculum can help with that. That's my view.
Sarah, would you like to add something?
I think just to go back to an earlier question where we were talking about, for example, flipped classroom, and actually, in my experience, first-year students are very capable of embracing these innovations, and actually do so as well, if not better, than those higher up the curriculum. So I don't think we should, underestimate their ability to engage in this, but it is how we introduce it to them and how we take them from high school into university. As Susan mentions, that 6 week, I gave up just giving up 6 weeks of our first year in our new curriculum for a kind of introduction 6 weeks, which felt like a lot of time to come out of an already overcrowded curriculum. Obviously, we gave it veterinary relevance, but it was about that transition to university, and I think it does help. But I still think also that the first year students are very able to embrace actually many innovative and obviously evidence-based, pedagogically sound approaches to education, to higher education.
Thank you, Sarah.
I can say a word about that. Just
Monica, thank you.
I suspect that there is some connection with the assessment, because in Italy we are used to introduce new things, but not to explicit very well which part of the assessment is connected to these new things. And students need to have this feeling perfectly aligned. Otherwise, they discharge the things that are not related to the assessment.
I think that's a very good point, actually, because in another context, when you introduce a clinical skills lab, which I think all of us think the students are just going to love and get so involved with it because it's all these clinical skills, they can do suturing and so on. If you don't introduce an OSCE, they don't necessarily go to the skills lab. So it is that constructive alignment again between teaching, learning and assessment, and looking at your assessment and mapping that as well as your teaching is so crucial. That's a really good point.
Can I just come in on that, because I think it's a brilliant point, and it's another real area of interest for me about assessment literacy. Do the students understand, well, do we as staff understand what the programme of assessment is? Do students are we using the assessment in the right way to drive the learning? So I think it's a really great point. And the other thing that I wanted to pick up on from the previous question was, what we're definitely discovering is this, and I think, well, we knew it anyway, but in the face of the flipped classroom because of the pandemic, about half the students loved it, about half the students hated it. So we have to be careful of not putting students all in the one box. They're so heterogeneous that, and that's why I think the more different approaches we can have, albeit within a framework, the better, because it's more likely that something will appeal to the students. Because if we think of them all in the same box, then we miss the point, we miss the context, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I see another comment. I don't know if, okay, Gualtiera agrees with Monica. That's good for the Department of Bologna that they agree together. So I thank you very much, the speakers and all the audience, for the participation and the involvement that was with question via chat, but it worked well. If it is possible, I would like to remember you that this afternoon there will be a session that will be held in Italian. That's to have a more useful environment for the Italian establishments. So thank you, Sarah and Susan, that I don't think will be with us this afternoon. And if it is possible, okay, this is the program. I would like to remember just one thing, that the YouTube link to join the session of the afternoon is different from the YouTube link of this morning. So be careful, because if you select the wrong link, you will see the program for the entire day, but nothing will start. So thank you very much, and see you later again. Bye.